All right, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're exploring the captivating story of a guy who is practically the patron saint of philosophy. We're talking about a man whose brilliant, completely restless mind literally changed the course of human history. So for the next few minutes, we are going to unpack the absolute foundations of Western thought by looking closely at the man who started the whole shebang right in the heart of ancient Athens.
Now think about this profound mystery for a second. We're going back about 2,400 years ago in Athens, where a man was actually sentenced to death. But here's the kicker. He wasn't a murderer, he wasn't a traitor, and he definitely wasn't a thief. He was condemned simply for his curiosity, literally put to death for asking too many questions. I mean, how does a society even reach a point where pure inquiry becomes a capital offense? Well, to figure that out, we really have to understand the man himself. If you're picturing a great philosopher as this pristine, majestic figure carved from perfectly white marble, you'd be entirely wrong about Socrates. By all accounts, the guy was famously unwashed, highly eccentric, and, well, quite frankly, considered pretty ugly by his peers. He was described as chubby, with a really long, snub nose, but beneath that unkempt exterior, he possessed this immense, magnetic charisma and a razor-sharp intellect. Plus, he was no coward. In his younger years, he was actually a brave, decorated soldier who fought right on the front lines against the Spartans in the Peloponnesian War. Part 1. The man who asks questions. You see, Socrates didn't just lock himself away in some ivory tower to write books. No, he spent his middle years just wandering around the bustling marketplace of Athens, stopping ordinary folks, politicians, soldiers, carpenters, just to ask them questions. His approach was totally different from the established norms of the day. Back then, wealthy families would send their sons to these guys called sophists, who were basically highly paid, clever teachers of public speaking. Socrates was the exact opposite of that. He never charged a single coin for his time, mostly because he insisted he had absolutely nothing to teach. He claimed he actually knew nothing at all. Just imagine the scene here. This ragged man stopping the most powerful politicians in the city, asking them to define basic concepts, and then publicly embarrassing them when they completely failed. Naturally, this made him incredibly popular with the youth, but the wealthy sophists, yeah, they absolutely despised him.
Part 2. The Gadfly of Athens.
Now, he viewed himself in a very specific and honestly somewhat irritating way. He proudly considered himself a gadfly. If you don't know what that is, it's basically a sticky, annoying insect that buzzes around a horse and bites it. So just like that insect, Socrates buzzed around the citizens of Athens. And he didn't do it to cause serious harm, no. His goal was to bite them intellectually. He wanted to wake them up from their mental slumber, forcing them to actually think about what they were doing and what they just blindly believed without questioning. Let's look at a classic Socratic trap he set for a man named Euthydemus. Socrates hits him with a simple question. Is deception immoral? Euthydemus, probably thinking it's an incredibly obvious question, says, well, of course it is. But then Socrates flips it. He presents this scenario. What if your friend is terribly depressed, about to end his own life, and you steal his knife to stop him? That is clearly an act of deception, but is it immoral? Euthydemus is totally cornered and forced to admit that actually, no, stealing the knife in that specific context is a good thing. Bam. With one clever counterexample, a rigid moral rule is completely shattered. And that right there was his genius. For Socrates, a conversation was a massive success if it ended with a super confident, maybe arrogant person suddenly realizing they actually knew very little. You'd have a seasoned military commander start a chat completely certain he knows exactly what courage is, but after just 20 minutes with Socrates, the guy's head is completely spinning. He just loved revealing the limits of understanding and dismantling those lifelong assumptions. He firmly believed, down to his core, that it was far better to know you don't understand something than to blindly, stubbornly think you do.
Part 3. What is true wisdom?
So this relentless pursuit of truth leads us to a really pivotal moment involving his good friend, Chaerephon. Chaerephon actually traveled to the Oracle of Delphi, which was this priestess of Apollo who usually answered questions in super cryptic riddles. And he asks her, flat out, if there is anyone wiser than Socrates. The oracle's answer? An absolute definitive no. When Socrates heard about this, he was genuinely shocked. I mean, how could he, a guy who constantly claimed to know absolutely nothing, be the wisest man in all of Athens? So naturally, he spent years trying to prove the oracle wrong by interrogating anyone who was considered an expert.
But, after all those intense interrogations, he finally realized the oracle was spot on. Everyone else was essentially building these massive sandcastles of false certainty. Sure, they were good at their specific day-to-day jobs, like carpentry or soldiering, but they falsely assumed this made them truly wise about the grand nature of existence. Socrates really was the wisest because he alone possessed the self-awareness to admit he knew nothing. True wisdom, as he beautifully proved, is knowing the exact limits of your own knowledge.
Part 4. Hemlock and Execution. Unfortunately, all this relentless questioning and dismantling of authority finally caught up with him. In 399 BC, a guy named Meletus drags the 70-year-old Socrates into court, throwing out accusations that he's corrupting the youth and disrespecting the gods. A massive jury of 501 citizens puts it to a vote, and by a shockingly narrow margin, they actually find him guilty. Now, at this point, he so easily could have talked his way out of a death sentence. He could have just apologized or maybe begged for exile. But instead, staying incredibly true to his gadfly nature, he completely antagonizes the jury even further by claiming he did absolutely nothing wrong. In fact, he demands that Athens should reward him with free meals for life. As you can probably guess, the jury didn't really appreciate the sarcasm. They sentenced him to death by hemlock. He effectively forced their hand, choosing his deeply held principles over simple self-preservation. So we arrive at his final unwavering moments. He says his goodbyes to his wife and his 3 sons, and he gathers his closest students around him. Now remember, he had the option to run away. He could have just lived out his final days quietly, never asking a difficult question ever again, but he absolutely refused. He talked about having this inner voice that told him to question everything, and he decided he would much rather die than betray that voice. With absolute chilling calm, he drank the hemlock. The poison slowly paralyzed his body, and shortly after, the great philosopher died.
Part 5. The Unexamined Life.
Now, of course, the death of his physical body was by no means the death of his ideas. But here's the ultimate irony. For a man who is literally considered the absolute foundation of Western philosophy, Socrates refused to write a single word down. Not one. He firmly believed that a text was a dead thing. Think about it. It can't respond to you, it can't adapt its tone to the person reading it, and it certainly can't explain itself if you get confused. For him, a living, breathing, face-to-face conversation was infinitely superior to anything on a page.
So you might be wondering, if he never wrote a single thing down, how do we know all these incredible, specific details about his life? Well, we only know about his infuriating, totally brilliant personality because of his most famous student, Plato. Plato essentially acted as the Shakespeare of his time. He took the real flesh-and-blood Socrates and turned him into the main character of a series of magnificent literary dialogues. Through Plato's masterful, vivid writings, this stubborn man, who would rather die than stop thinking, gets to live on forever.
And that brings us to the end. I want to leave you with this final, highly provocative thought derived directly from Socrates' core message. It's a concept to really challenge you today. An unexamined existence is fit for sheep, not humans. It really forces us to pause and ask ourselves a deeply uncomfortable question. Are you actually genuinely examining your own life, your deep-seated assumptions, and your core beliefs, or are you just comfortably following the herd? It's definitely something to chew on. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you next time.